Hi, this is Debbie Aldrich. Welcome to the Debbie Aldrich Show. Tonight I have a special guest, Lieutenant Colonel retired Sargis Sangari. He's going to join me tonight. He is Iranian-born, raised in the U.S., and a Syrian Iranian, basically, and has much to tell us about what's going on in Iran. So welcome to the show, Sangari, and I really appreciate your being here.
It's good to be here again, Debbie. Much appreciated.
So a lot has been happening in the Middle East and Iraq in particular. We've had, so I really want you to expand on the Iraq, Iran, and the U.S. situation that has gone on the last week, basically, and the last few days in particular in Iraq. We've had a plane downed accidentally, I'm not sure. Recently, Ukrainian plane. We had the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Iraq, as well as then the elimination of Soleimani, the henchman, I call the henchman of the IRGC for the Iranian regime. So can you give us some insight about that?
Well, it's very simple. We went ahead and took out a major target, in this case, Soleimani, who was literally the individual who expanded the Iranian foreign policy throughout the entire region. So the leader of the Quds Force, who was the main individual who initially came up with the idea of using proxies within the region, and then funded them and supported them and established them to become the main spearhead for the Iranian foreign policy within the region. So when we conducted that strike against him and killed him, it reset everything in our negotiations going forward.
Yeah, so how do you feel about the taking out of Soleimani? Was that a necessity in going forward with the foreign policy? Could we have gone forward? I mean, he has been responsible for many decades of terrorism, of mass murders, of calling for the mass murders of many Iranians in Iran, as well as targeting Iranians outside of Iran, and terrorist attacks, ordering terrorist attacks around the world, meaning the EU, Europe, and also here in the US. So how do we compare this to taking out Osama bin Laden and al-Baghdadi? It doesn't equate. I mean, those two were only on the scene for a short time, where Soleimani's been on the scene for decades.
We had posted on the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement the entire bio of Soleimani. We had actually literally gone through his history. And if you look into his history, you'll see that from the time he started within Iranian politics when he was younger, even going back to the U.S. Embassy taking in Tehran, how the Iranian foreign policy started developing. And you come full force to where we are today. The attack against Soleimani resets everything, as I had said previously. How does it reset everything? It is the only way that the United States actually communicates its new foreign policy to the government of Iran. I was in Iraq, and a soldier of mine, the first tour, asked me, he said, what do you think about our foreign policy, sir? I go, well, depends. What are you asking? He goes, well, we're on the ground here. We got soldiers. We got aircrafts. We got the full force of the U.S. military. I said, yeah, that sounds good, but that's not your foreign policy. He said, how's that not our foreign policy? I said, because your foreign policy has to have an expression, right? And I asked him, do you know how you express your foreign policy? He goes, by being here. I said, no. I said, you express it by what we did a month ago, where we came to a checkpoint. We saw the enemy checkpoint, and the vehicle behind us fired at the overwatch position. When those rounds impacted the individuals that were in that overwatch position, that's the communication of your foreign policy. You are nothing more than an instrument of that foreign policy. Now you are here representing the United States, but if you never pulled a trigger during the entire combat operations that we were conducting within the region, nobody would understand your foreign policy. Since then, the individuals who were holding that checkpoint realized that U.S. will show up at checkpoints, and if you have them set up, you'll get killed. We didn't have any more illegal checkpoints set up by insurgency in our sector. So by killing Suleiman, U.S. in that moment, using all the instruments to its ability when it comes to the multi-power, explained its stance on foreign policy. And then Pompeo went on a few days later and said, our job is to deter and defend against Iran. Well, deter and defend has to be explained somehow. The way you explain it, you kill an individual, you deter them from being able to expand their foreign policy within the region, and you defend against what they were doing within the region. Now, since then, the Iranians have also expressed to us that they want to remain with the same foreign policy. How do they do that? By the fact that they have gone ahead and taken an individual who is literally the mirror of Soleimani and placed them in the leadership position. And just yesterday, there was 200 million euros check basically written, given to the Iranian Quds Force to use, and the Iranian Quds Force uses that money on the outside of Iran to expand the Iranian foreign policy, and that money has to be executed by 21st of March, which is the fiscal calendar year for the Iranians. So everything else that happens between pundits speaking on what took place as far as the strike is concerned, and the Democrats and Republicans jockeying for their messaging, is really for the internal consumption of Americans, and politicians usually use that just to be able to garner support for the next election. But your foreign policy is in the missile that literally strikes and kills the head of the Quds Force in Iraq.
Yeah, so that money you just mentioned, we know Iran has helped fund many terrorists throughout the Middle East. Hezbollah, Hamas, money has gone to them, as well as ISIS, as well as El Shabaab and Boko Haram and some of these other groups, destabilizing Northern Africa and the Middle East. Do you think that money that you said they have to use before, what is it, March? You said March 1st?
March 21st.
Or 21st will be used to continue to fund, as you said, their foreign policy, which is basically to destabilize the area. And as Islamists, as the leadership is, not the people so much, but the leadership, that is also to expand, I presume, Islamism, the form that radical Islamists practice.
I would not put it in that light, possibly. I would say that you have Orthodox within various different religious groups. You have them within the Christians that are Orthodox. You have them within the Jewish community. You have them in Islam. And I don't think anybody's ever used that term before, so I might as well, I'll introduce it there. The Islam that looks at the certain orthodoxy means that they have to follow those specific dictates. Iran's use of terror has more to do, is more pragmatic than anyone believes. They use it as an instrument for their foreign policy. It is not like the jihadist who's blowing himself up because he's looking for an end of the world solution. Iran is using it for their expansion within the regions. Look, Iran is in the tri-border areas in South America. Iran is in Africa. Every place there's a merchant that is from Lebanon, I guarantee you Hezbollah is there. Iran uses these means and ways to be able to expand its footprint, to be able to move money. Euros are easier to launder. That's why euros are such a significant use for Iran. Now, here's one thing I don't think people are looking at. Soleimani himself had become a destabilizing factor for the Iranian government. And why is that? When Iran struck the deal with the previous POTUS, 6 days after money was delivered, Soleimani was the main operator who had established the operation to be able to target and kill in Washington, D.C., the ambassador of Saudi Arabia to the United States. Iran sold out Soleimani directly to the U.S. for that operation. You fast forward to where we are today. You saw that people had risen up throughout the entire region. They had risen up in Lebanon against Iran, in Iraq against Iran, in Iran itself. Soleimani himself was an instrument that would be used to quell possibly any type of uprising. That is his job. However, in May of last year, Zarif himself put in his resignation. Zarif is an individual who rather work more through the international community. Zarif had seen that success by the fact that Iran sat across from the all the nations of the world, the I-5 nations, and struck a deal. Zarif was not in line and lockstep with how Soleimani was conducting his operations. And because of that, Zarif had made an ultimatum to the leadership of Iran, in this case Khamenei, and stated that, look, either it's going to be me or Soleimani. Soleimani had established an internal government inside of the Iranian government. The problem was the Quds Force was also linked to all these so-called proxies that were supposed to be used to fight against the United States, started also destabilizing areas that Iran was also in control of. If you think about it, who were these particular proxies that Soleimani was running? Who were they jeopardizing more? United States footprint in the Middle East or in Iraq, or Iran's ability to be able to be a stabilizing factor in Iraq? So if you're Iran and you're controlling the parliament of Iraq, and then now Soleimani, who has established a government within the government of Iran, is using the same proxies that are really destabilizing these individuals in the Iraqi government's hold and control on Iran, or I should say on Iraq, and is forcing individuals into the streets. This is where the friction point was for the Iranians within their own government. A group saying that he is now more of a problem for us as far as the control of the region than what he was initially used for combat operations, to be able to project our foreign policy to stabilize that region, because a destabilized Iraq is not good for Iran anyway. So I would not be surprised that there's individuals today in Iran that are happy that Soleimani has been killed, because since then, the restore and the control came back to Khamenei again. And you could see in the messaging that went out to all these surrogate groups or these proxies across the board that you cannot destabilize the countries that you are in. You are supposed to be part of our foreign policy projection, which means stable regions that are under our control. And we only bring you out when we need you in order to empower that foreign policy going forward. I hope that explains it from an angle that I don't think anybody else has looked at.
Yeah, that's a really unique and different angle from what we've been hearing on mainstream media and other news networks in regards to what is happening and what Iran's doing. One thing I wanted to ask you too was the Iraqis. How do the Iraqis feel about this? I actually spoke to a young man who was here, has been here for a few years as a refugee from Iraq. His father and brothers are still there. He was not happy about, he was actually happy about Soleimani being taken out, not happy and very concerned if America, the U.S. Withdraws from Iraq, and concerned about the Iranians there. He's very grateful to be here, and he said he's very worried about his family. Now, we know during the war that there are many cities throughout Iraq that really lost, I mean, were basically destroyed. And it's, by basically the war between Iran and the U.S. battling out in Iraq. And the other thing I wanted to say, the term Islamist that I used, I've actually heard a lot of counterterrorism and Middle East experts use that term Islamist to explain kind of radical Islamists or Muslims. Although we know there are also really good, and I just want to make that clear, good, peaceful Muslims as well. But your explanation was very interesting about Iran. Now the power going back to Khomeini and possibly being a stabilizer. They did send rockets towards the U.S. troops in Iraq. However, they didn't hit them. Do you believe that was intentional?
Look, I mean, it doesn't matter
To
because
miss
there's
them,
a
that
couple of
is.
things that, yeah, the Iran struggles for certain things. Remember, I told you all the strike against Soleiman is your foreign policy right there. Pound, he's dead. That's your foreign policy expression. You're expressing your foreign policy. Everything that happened after that, with what the media covered, what they said, the Republicans, Democrats, all that is for internal consumption. Well, Iranians have to have the same thing. They have to have that internal consumption when it
Right.
comes to what they're doing. For their foreign policy projection, it was very simple. When those missiles are fired, Iran is in a stronger position, whether they hit, kill anybody or not, because Iran now goes back and says, look, we're the only ones as lead of Islam that are fighting against the United States. Saudi Arabia, what are you doing? You're sitting there and writing checks to them. Okay, Turkey, what are you doing? You're a NATO member. So we don't want to hear from you any longer to say that you have to be a leader of Islam. We had written an article a long time ago, who speaks for Islam, who should. And this has always been a struggle and a fight internally between these nations. You know, Saudi Arabia controls all these religious sites. It says that I'm the lead of Sunni Islam, but Israel can do overflight positions, overflight operations on their airspace. At the same time, Turkey says we're the lead for Islam, but Turkey has to target Islamists that are operating in Syria and other locations if it wants to be a member of NATO. Iran is the one that actually is able to project against the United States and say, look, I'm still the lead of Islam and I'm the only one who's able to fight against them. Not only have I sat now across the table and brought all of them to the table. Remember, that's a pretty significant picture when you have all these particular sanctions against a country, and that country is able to sit across from all these major nations, powers, global powers, and strike a deal with them. And now Iran is attacking a major global power, although it makes sense for us to be able to de-escalate. From their perspective is that we're the only ones who can stand up to them military-wise, and we're the only ones who are going to go ahead and stand to them when it comes to using the instruments of power as far as what governance is all about. With all that said, Iran's attacks against the United States are also part of a dictate of the orthodoxy of Islam. So because they're an Islamic constitution, they cannot run away from that orthodoxy. What is that orthodoxy? Part of that orthodoxy that is written in Islam is blood for blood. So you have to avenge. Iranians could not just not attack, could not try to kill someone on the other side. Now, in the morning, prior to those attacks, they had conducted attacks in 3 major cities of Saudi Arabia. Or I shouldn't say major, smaller cities. But they had conducted bombings and also small armed fires within those cities. People had died there. For them, it didn't matter where the blood for blood came as long as it satisfied that dictate. Once you've satisfied the dictates that are part of your constitution, now you can move forward with what most of the Western nations believe is a part of this diplomatic negotiation that is done on the global stage.
And they have said, the Iranians have said, they are withdrawing completely from, as well. I mean, the U.S. Did from the JCPOA, or better known as the Iran deal. And we know now that they have been working on and plan on working on building a nuclear facility, a bomb. Whether it gets to that point, we don't know. Do you believe that is their plan? And we know Europe has tried very hard to keep the JCPOA alive, but after Soleimani's death, Iran made the statement that they're done with it, and moving forward with their own, as you say, foreign policy.
Well, it was going to expire anyway, so March next,
Right.
it doesn't matter. It's something that was going to expire, so they might as well pull out now and say we pulled out, but it was going to expire, and then try to reset with a new possible deal in the long run. Look, Iran's long-term vision for the region is that they have to get to a point where they could squeeze Israel enough that in the future, whether it be 100 years from now, 200 years from now, that Israel is no longer the state that it is today. But they will have strategic patience in that process. Iran's ability to try to get to a new negotiations with a possibly, hopefully, with a new incoming administration. If President Trump is reelected again, everything will be reset for Iran. Now, Iran has 4 years to get to possibly a much more stronger deal, maybe on the U.S. side, where you have the ballistic capability agreement split from the nuclear piece. But at the same time, Iran knows that would be a short-term deal, and it would be possibly willing to strike that deal just to satisfy the foreign policy consumption for us in the West, because they know that 4 years from now, the current POTUS, President Trump, is probably going to be out of office. After he wins this, he only has one more term. Who will come after him? Nobody knows. So Iran does calculate in those terms. The issue we have with Iran,
they're in the long game. Basically, what you're saying is they're in the long game.
Yes, once we pulled out of the deal, one problem that Iran has, and we have, is that Iran says, what assurances do I have that if I strike another deal with the current POTUS, maybe now, maybe even a year from now, if he wins re-election, that the next administration is not going to come in and break that deal? What's in it for me? So they will continue with their current foreign policy when it comes to, as far as using proxies to their benefit, because they know that the future battlefield is really shaped based on proxy wars within the region. Everybody uses them. And they will continue to see what they could leverage maybe for themselves when it comes to possible deals that will keep them viable within the region. Look, even when we put sanctions against Iran, we had to keep the port of Charbagh open for them, so India could develop that port, because India is important for us when it comes to a leverage against China, a buffer, and to create a railhead that goes into Afghanistan, so we could put pressure on Pakistan to bring the Taliban to the table. But at the same time, we had to allow Iran to be able to sell Iranian oil to Iraq. So Iran will always have these open gaps within the sanctions requirements to be able to work with his partners within the region or his neighbors. If Iraq is burning, it's not going to serve Iran well. Iran will exist, but it will not serve it well. If Iraq is stabilized, that means U.S. is in the region. Iran still won't like it with us being there, but Iran will still continue slowly building its ability when it comes to global influence within the region, because everybody still needs all the resources that are important for their countries to run, that are sitting in Iran and Iraq and within those oil-rich nations.
Absolutely. But with these sanctions placed on Iran, heavy sanctions, are they having an impact? I mean, they're having some impact. Are the Iranians feeling, or the regime and Iran feeling squeezed at all? Is this why we've seen some escalation on their part of terror and attacks and things of that nature? Or is this just status quo for them?
No, look, they're feeling squeezed. The 200 million euros that I talked about had to come out of their reconstruction and infrastructure development. I mean, if you're an Iranian on the ground right now suffering and you have to take bulks of cash for it to be weighed, basically, you're not going to like the fact that the Quds Force has more money. But it's just a reality. Iran is not able to escape from that particular foreign policy they have established. Why? Because again, part of it is also because in the Islamic constitution, those orthodoxies of the dictates of Islam are important. Look, I'll give you an example. People always throw that word Islamicide. If you are an individual who's living in the United States and you are following the orthodoxies of the dictates of the of Islamic dictates, you are a key factor in how and why these particular ideologies are able to expand themselves. If I go tomorrow and put my hand on on a book that has those dictates in it, well, that means I am abiding to those dictates, and those orthodoxies have to be followed. That's the issue I think a lot of people don't understand when it comes to Orthodox Islam. And again, I'll introduce that as my term if you want, just like we put the backyard wars, because it's not in the Islamists. It's about the orthodoxy of following the dictates of that particular mandate. And you could do that if you're sitting in the West. You could do that in Iraq. You could do that in Iran. You could do it in Europe. And if you look at any religion that is out there, is the orthodoxies within that religion that really adhere to the dictates of the religion. In this case, the ones who are the Orthodox Islamists, Islam, who followed in that capacity, those are the ones that you have to be careful about. In this case, unfortunately, Iran is an Islamic nation, just like Iraq is as a Islamic constitution, Saudi Arabia, they have to follow the dictates of that orthodoxy.
I've heard Muslims themselves talk about that what ISIS is doing and what they've done is not adherence to Islam. And that kind of opens up another can of worms, and have used that term Islamist as well. But digressing a little bit, I like your explanation, and I agree. People that adhere to the orthodoxy of their own brand of religion do take it to the letter of the law, basically, of what's written in their texts. So where do you see this going now for the Iraqi people, for the U.S. relations? Iran was telling Iraq they want the Americans out of Iraq. The Iraqis evidently don't want the Americans out. So where does this leave all of us in this quagmire in Iraq at this point? Where do we go from here? Or where do you see this going from here? Nobody could really tell, but
look, it depends on where our foreign policy is going to go. I think the current POTUS has a pretty good idea of how he wants to slowly go through this process, strategic patience. There's two things that will happen. Either the U.S. will remain in Iraq or it will leave. And as you can see, the president has said, I'm going to pull out of the Middle East. So what is he doing? Ever since he came into office, he put pressure on the NATO nations to build their capacity to support NATO. So he's got him to a point now, after all these years, to finally flip the bill to where he said today 130 million. Well, 130 million being added to the NATO coffers started years ago with him putting pressure on them as soon as he came into office. He needed to build the capacity of NATO, then turn around and say, guess what we're going to do? I know by law, anything that is in the South is not a NATO member. I'm not only going to go bring India into the NATO membership, So that's a nation that is south of the in the south hemisphere. But I'm gonna go ahead and also force NATO now to be able to take a larger role when it comes to the Middle East. Right now, the head of coalition that is there to fight ISIS is Canada, and I believe that his future steps are to get NATO to be strong enough where NATO is going to take the lead in Iraq, where he's going to have a smaller signature with U.S. footprint, and now they have to take the brunt of managing the Iraqi streets and or the Arab streets. So if you are the UK and you are Germany and you are France and you're bypassing the sanctions, guess what I just did to you? Not only did I pull the rug from underneath your feet by pulling out of the Iran nuclear, which we had said a long time ago in the Near East was an economic deal, I have forced you to put your money, skin into the game, and I'm now have forced you to take a larger role in the Middle East. So now you not only are paying money into it, now you are on the ground, and you have to now physically support your own foreign policy on the ground. And where did I put you? I put you right in the mouth of the, as we say, the wolf, who has a foreign policy that is adherent to the dictates of Islam, that's going to take chumps out of you while you're conducting these type of stabilizing operations within the region. So finally, the Europeans are going to understand what the U.S. had to deal with and try to manage this piece. I think in this capacity, he's pretty much training NATO to understand how U.S. managed the region and training them to understand how they have to start taking global leadership initiative within those regions. Now, that puts NATO also in the position of being a adversary to China and Russia, who are intent on ensuring that U.S. and NATO and these type of coalition to allow to remain in the Middle East. Because as long as they remain in the Middle East and China is dependent on the resources of the Middle East, then it will put NATO head to head with what we call the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and China and Russia. He's doing a slow play on them, but at the end of the day, if he withdraw troops out of the region and we're sitting home and there's nothing there that really we need in order to become a global power, and you've gotten the people who should be have taken onus for their actions within the region, then those are the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese, and we'll let the Iranians and the Iraqis figure it out.
Yeah, that's a lot there to to think about, and definitely Russia's been a big player. We also know China is in the mix. Iran has oil sitting on China's docks. I don't know if it's been touched or not by China, but we can't forget about China also wanting to be a player in this whole scenario. So I guess we'll see what happens tomorrow. And every day, like you said, every day is a new news day, news cycle. You never know. We had that plane shot down, the Ukrainian plane shot down. It appears that a missile hit it, whether it was accidental or intentional. Most likely, I think the consensus is it was probably accidental because they were firing missiles at that time, and the targets, there were Iranian people on the flight. So what's your take on that?
In a 48-hour period, Soleimani dies. Iran has earthquake within the southern Iran, and what we may consider as a light earthquake for the Iranians, because their buildings, they don't have the technology that most countries do to be able to support their facilities. Right next to their nuclear facilities, you get a 4.9 magnitude earthquake. These are around the Bushehr area. Then you have the trampling of those mourners at the Soleimani's funeral, and then you have a Ukrainian aircraft get shot down. Iran right now is internally going through a lot of maturations
Mhm.
because of all these things. It will take some time for Iran to kind of digest it. It's the Iranian government ability to control what the proxies are doing outside of Iran, and what the Iranian people are doing internally in Iran. That is going to lead us to where we can see maybe a new emerging government, because Iran is going to have its elections this year. And frankly, if Suleiman wasn't dead, he probably would have won the Iranian elections. And that would have meant that we would have probably had to go to all out war with Iran. So good thing that he's dead. A future war was averted. Um, so it's coincidence that they happen, but those coincidences have given us at least some time for Iran to be able to take a
Mhm.
step back and digest what needs to be the next step. Remember, when you kill someone, you get into the thinking cycle of the other individual. And the Iranians, like
Mhm.
everything else, they're creative because of the necessity of how they want to survival, basically. So
Mhm.
when you have no options and you know you're gonna die as a government, you find creative ways of possibly surviving. And we'll see what Iran may have in going forward in the future, what their plans may be. But as long as the dictates of Islam are there, we should have some kind of a window as to some of the problems they're going to have internally when it comes to being able to express their foreign policy in ways and means that Western nations do.
Yeah, absolutely. You brought up a really, really good point that right now Iran has suffered major blows on every side, and it must make the regime beneficial to the West and probably the Iraqi people, but the regime is probably feeling a little bit low and trying to adapt and try to restructure where they go from here, as you know, it is just kind of the norm of behavior. People do find ways to adapt and be creative. And after all, they are Persians, and Persians have been historically very highly intelligent, productive people. So there's still a lot of people in Iran that are suffering for lack of food, for lack of jobs, a lot of things happening there. Now the earthquake, which kind of reminds me of what's happened here recently in, I believe it was yesterday, Puerto Rico, who suffered an earthquake as well, the damage. And again, another place that, you know, the structural integrity of buildings aren't what they are in many of our more affluent countries like America, even though Puerto Rico is the territory, or perhaps in Europe. These countries, these places do suffer a lot of damage without a lot of reinforcement in their buildings, and some of the buildings are also, you know, old and not updated. So a lot happening in Iran, a lot happening in the region, and to Iran and to the people there in the Middle East, and really, you know, where it goes from here is anyone's guess. But bringing Europe to the table and saying, look, enough is enough. You've got to get on board. You've got to do your part. You've got to get with the, you know, be more active in the region and with NATO. I think is a good thing. They've kind of sat back and just let, as Trump has said in the past, we've been carrying the ball for a long time. So time for them to step up to the plate. So it seems like that is what's going to happen moving forward. So any last words for us, Lieutenant Colonel Sargis Sangari, before we leave? Uh, and I guess
No,
we'll have to
it's
do this another day because the news cycle does change rapidly.
look, it's the Middle East. Every 5 minutes something changes. But I think what I tried to do today kind of give an understanding of how it's shaping the foreign policy and what I believe is how the president is looking at it. Look, unless you're sitting in the brain of the decision maker, all you could do is look at patterns and kind of figure out where somebody might be going. You could try to give your best advice to them. You don't know how they're going to digest it. So a lot of times what we've done with the Near East, we've given an advice. I think they've digested it the way we were expecting them to digest it. It seems like it's going forward in the right direction, but again, there's always those offshoots that you never think about. Hopefully, there's going to be peace within the region. The biggest thing for me is to make sure that our boys are safe and secure and alive. For us, the Syrian Christians are spread throughout the entire Middle East region, and they don't have any way of really today protecting themselves. They just have not done internally what they need to do to build their infrastructure capacity when it comes to capabilities to defend themselves on the ground. But like I said, you want to survive, you better come up with a way of doing it. You cannot do it through others, because President Trump has already said, if I'm not going to support Europe and I'm going to expect them to do it, why do you think that him or anyone else on the global stage is going to say, I'm going to come over there, I'm going to spend my time and blood and treasure for you who do not want to take a step forward to do it for yourself on your own?
Absolutely, 100%. Absolutely. Everybody has to do their part, and one country and one people cannot bear the brunt in these issues, particularly in the Middle East. That is the hotbed, and where a lot of countries depend on their oil from the Middle East, and then we have Israel also in the mix, and Iran has threatened them. We can save that for another day for sure, but that's part of the puzzle as well. But thank you so much. It's really late where you're at, and you've had a long day. Really appreciate your insight and take and explanation, because all those little details I think are really important. As in general, the American public gets bits and pieces and sound bites without getting a full kind of explanation of the interworkings of what's happening there on the ground, and what these countries that you have known, and you've been on the ground in Iraq, you have served there, you were also born in Iran, you're an Assyrian, you were raised here in the US. You have a lot of insight on the inner workings of this region and the mindset of these people and what's going on. So really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Anytime, Debbie.
And that's a wrap, folks, with Lieutenant Colonel Sargis Sangari and Debbie Aldrich. Thank you for watching, everybody. Till next time. Good night.